Well, welcome everyone. I see participants are still signing in, so I'm going to give a brief introduction. Um, so thank you for joining today's webinar, Lab Work to Leadership, Thriving in a Science Job You Weren't Trained For. I think it's a very compelling title. So my name is Reinhard Reitmeyer. I'm a professor emeritus in Department of Biochemistry at the University of Toronto, and I'll be helping to guide you through today's session. This webinar is sponsored by the ASBMB Education and Professional Development Committee, of which I am happy to be a member. Um, so, based on the title, today's session will explore the challenges of stepping into leadership roles when most training really focuses on, quite frankly, the technical aspects of doing science. I think most importantly, you'll gain some practical strategies to develop leadership skills, be able to take on new responsibilities with more confidence, and prepare for the next step in your career. So I'll just make a remark about leadership. When you're in a lab doing research, you're publishing papers, going to a meeting, you're already a leader in your field. So this concept should be nothing new, whether you're an undergrad, a grad student, postdoc, early career researcher, new professor, et cetera, going into industry. Always think about, leadership and leadership skills. So there's a few quick housekeeping items before we dive in. Um, Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box anytime. We'll try to answer as many as possible before the end of the presentation. There will also be a bit of an interactive component to this webinar, and Dr. Hemstra will guide you through that. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ASBMB website. So now I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Jennifer Hemstra. She's chair and Charles Allen Thomas Professor in Chemistry at Washington University in St. Louis. Jen has built a really impressive career navigating both, the lab bench, the science part, and leadership roles. And she knows from firsthand experiences the challenges of stepping into positions you weren't formally trained for. Today, she'll share some practical strategies for developing leadership skills, thriving in your career, whatever that may be, and how to make the most of opportunities as they arise. So, Jen, it's good to see you again. We're thrilled to have you with us, and over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Reinhardt, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining. That was actually the perfect way to set up where I'm going to start on this topic, that we're going to focus in on these leadership skills. And these are such important skills for our careers. But we don't get nearly as much training in these areas compared to the technical skills that we need for our careers. But the hopeful thing, if I leave you with nothing else today, it's the idea that leadership skills are just like all of those science and technical skills in that they may not come naturally to us, but we can learn them. We just have to be intentional. And also that everyone is a leader. If you are here, you are a leader. That often when you hear the term leadership, you might think of someone who gets up in front of big crowds and gives, rousing speeches, or holds certain leadership titles. But leadership is really so much more broad than that. And so I want to start out with a quick crowdsourcing actually around that. And so this link should be showing up in the chat. You can also just use your phone and navigate to that QR code or text in, and this will take you to a poll everywhere. I'll say if it asks you for a name, you don't have to put in your name, though you can if you want, but feel free to be anonymous. And it'll pop up on the next slide, but when you answer, just use one word, or no spaces in your answer. All right, hopefully everyone's gotten logged into that. So in one word, what are examples of the sorts of things that leaders do or the skills that they use? Yeah, they're role models, they do management, collaboration, they work with people. Excellent. They spearhead, inspire, communicate. listen, make decisions, influence, integrate. Oh, such great answers. Let's see, what else do we have popping up? They connect, coordinate, time management. That's a really important one. They lead, yes. Supporting, solving, mentor, yes. Attention to details, really important. So many good answers, right? And so this really highlights that leadership is this incredibly complex topic and it's extremely broad and it encompasses so much of the work that you are doing, whether you are a student or a postdoc or staff or faculty member, industry scientist, science communicator, working in a government lab, working in policy, wherever you are using leadership skills because really leaders are anyone who see a way that something could be better or who work with people to create change or to get work done. And leaders use, all of these different types of skills and so much more. So if you are working in a lab, if you are mentoring anyone else, if you're anyone who just looks at the workplace you're in or the world in general and says, oh, that little thing could be better, and then creates a plan to make that change happen, then that is leadership. All right. So now, as you think about leadership skills you need right now, what are the most essential skills for your current role? So wherever you are right now, we'll talk about future roles in a little bit, but thinking about where you are right now, what are the skills that you're using? A lot of yeah, time management, communication, organization, innovation, teamwork. That's a really good one. Thinking. Excellent. Yeah, critical thinking. See, time management showing up really big. That's a common one. Yeah, organization, how you hold all of this together. Let's see, what else? Multitasking, connecting, flexibility. Great. So this also shows that we need a lot of different leadership skills in order to be successful in our current roles. But then this brings up the question, right? As scientists, we receive so much technical training, but when do we ever get trained in all of these other skills that are so essential for our success in these roles? I will share that the reason why I'm here talking to you is that I had a moment in my career where in a rather dramatic fashion, I had this realization of like, I wasn't trained for this, right? I had phenomenal mentors in all of the research labs I worked in as an undergrad, as a grad student, in my postdoc research. I've been surrounded by wonderful colleagues, but yet there was this skill set that was so essential, but that especially 20 years ago, we just weren't really talking about in science. And so the way that I had this realization is that I was about 3 years into my independent faculty career. And so I was an assistant professor, gung ho, gonna make the research happen, and was leading a group, so excited to be doing that, kind of living my dream career, trying to get tenure. And I was sitting in my office one day, and one of my colleagues came in. And very thankfully, this was one of my peers. It was not a senior colleague, it was a fellow assistant professor. But this colleague came into my office, and, I think she closed the door and she was like, okay, so I have some bad news for you. It turns out, I heard kind of through the grapevine, through someone in your lab, that there's this big conflict that's been brewing in your group and is turning into a big deal. And like people are taking sides and it's getting really ugly and it's really distracting to everyone. And if you don't do something about it, it sounds like there's going to be like this social implosion in your lab. Just thought you'd want to know that. And then she looked at me. I don't think she said, like, good luck with that. But her face kind of said that. And then she walked out of my office. And I will never, ever forget sitting there at my desk. And all I wanted to do was crawl under my desk and, like, rock back and forth in the fetal position and, hope this would go away. Um, but instead, I sat down, I opened up my computer, and I did this. I literally Google searched conflict resolution because I had no idea what else to do. Right. And so I read everything that I could for like an hour. And then I sent an email that was like mandatory, group meeting, 2 p.m. today. And I didn't handle it as well as I could have. But this got me realizing that there is this whole set of skills like conflict resolution and time management and so much more that are essential, and that the resources are out there. We just need to go and find those and utilize those in order to develop these skills. So, all right, back to you. We all need leadership skills. They're critical for so much, right? I talked about conflict resolution. You all put up there a ton of skills that are so important for your jobs right now. Some others I tend to think about a lot are, setting goals for ourselves, for others, that time management and organization of our calendars, how we stay motivated, especially right now in the midst of some really difficult, challenging, uncertain times in science, how we motivate ourselves and those around us, how we create vision and how we maximize impact, how we communicate, and how we deal with feedback, conflict, and all of those other interpersonal issues, and so much more. But there's this challenge that we weren't really trained for this. And so about 10 years ago, I started talking more about these topics. And someone in my lab said, "You should really write a book about this." To which I repeatedly said, "No, no, I could never do that." And finally got convinced to do exactly that. And so I'm excited to share that last fall, this book, Labwork to Leadership, came out. There's a QR code there if you want to learn more about it. But the goal behind this was to say, hey, there's all of this information out there to teach us these skills. But it's often written for people who are running companies, not for people who are working in science, and especially not for people who are working in science in academia. And so this was an opportunity to bring a bunch of that together and offer it up. I joke that it's like talking leadership over drinks or a cup of coffee with a friend. And the really big take home from this is where I started, that these leadership skills are just like our research skills, right? The first time each of us walked into a lab or sat down at a computer terminal to do coding, we didn't really, we didn't like intuitively know how to do that, but we were able to learn and practice and grow and develop those skills. And all of those leadership skills work the same way. All right. So now focusing on the goal here is to send you away with one skill that you want to work on building and having an action plan for how you can build that skill. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about and write down, what is one leadership skill that looking ahead 5 years, wherever you think you might be in 5 years, what's a skill that you will need then, but haven't necessarily built up to the level at which you will need it? And then why will this be important for your career path? So I'll give you 2 minutes, write a few thoughts down, just on a notepad in front of you, on your phone, whatever it might be.
And when you're done composing your leadership skill, maybe put that into the chat so we can all have a look at it. That'd be great.
Yeah, definitely feel free to share in the chat.
I'll share one with you, Jen, while we're waiting, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I mean, communication will come up a lot. I mean, the great leaders are great communicators. You know that. There's lots of examples of that through history, right? But I always neglected in that regard was developing good listening skills, actually. People think it's a one way, you're up there on a stage or you're inspiring people, but I think the best leaders actually, listen really, really well, and then take all that in. And I think the word that somebody told me one time was when you're dealing with those others around you is sort of a level of empathy for others, right? Understanding. And the only way you
Uh,
get that understanding is through communicating, effectively. You talked about this conflict, that you had early on. There's probably a communication breakdown in that somewhere that you weren't even aware of this. So that's sort of the signal right away that something's not quite right here, right? And so I think listening,
yeah.
developing listening skills is, something that I had to learn for sure.
That's so important, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I'll say this: people are throwing this in the chat. Also, if you want to throw into the chat how you've developed these leadership skills in the past, this is what we're going to talk about. We'd love to hear from you first. And while you all do that, I'll share as well that yes, the listening is so important, and that you hit it perfectly. That empathy is that first step towards communication. And looking back, I would have handled that conflict so much better, or it might have never happened if I had already gained that skill. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit about getting feedback and, going back maybe 10 years or so, a lot of the feedback I received from my own research lab was to build my listening skills. And that's something that I've worked really hard on. And it's been fun to see that no longer show up in my feedback, and we've moved on to other things, right? There's always problems and places you want to improve, and the goal is to keep having better problems. um, all right, if anyone's willing to drop, I think we'll be able to see if you chat to everyone or to hosts and panelists, or no, just to everyone. If you chat to everyone, I don't know that I'm seeing them, but that's okay. Well, maybe we'll keep moving. And if you're able to drop in the chat, go for it. But if not, that's okay too. The main thing is that you come away from this with a skill that you want to build. And then we'll talk about this in a little bit, but a plan for exactly how you're going to do that. So, okay. So if you want to build a skill, how do we build these leadership skills? I keep saying it's just like our research or science or technical skills. And so we can use a very similar process. When we think about how we learn our technical skills, what do we do, right? When you need to run a PCR or some new protocol that you've never run before, we learn from others. But that alone isn't enough. You need to, get into a lab and try it out yourself, develop by doing. And then often, especially if things don't work well the first time, you get some feedback and you refine. And then, really, the way that you're going to learn the best is to turn around and teach that skill to someone else. And so we can do exactly the same with our leadership skills. It just looks a little bit different than if we were learning, say, a PCR. All right, so we'll start with learning from others, and I'll just give you a few quick vignettes on each of these, and then we'll get back to something really practical that you can work towards in the coming week or two. All right, so I mentioned this, but there is good news that there is a wealth of information out there about these leadership skills. This was a really eye-opening experience for me. About 10 years ago, I was talking with one of my friends who is outside of science. He's actually a leadership expert. And I said, "Oh, yes, I'm doing these things with my group, and we're like talking about culture of candor. And this is so innovative because not a lot of people in science are doing this." And he looked at me and said, "Jen, that's just organizational leadership." And I might have been offended in that moment, but I wasn't at all. It really was eye-opening that there is this whole field of scholarship out there in organizational psychology, leadership, organizational leadership, business, where people actually, just like we do biochemistry and molecular bio research, folks are doing research on psychology and on businesses and on leadership styles to figure out what's most effective. And then there's tons of resources where all of this is, packaged up and conveyed in a way. It's kind of like the public science communication of the psychology scholarship through books and podcasts, articles. I've got a QR code here. This takes you to a list of some of my favorite books that are referenced in my book. I will apologize. My time management has been such that I haven't quite finished this list, but most of it is there. And so we can do that. But those resources, we can listen to those on our own. But how do we make that even more enriching? By sharing it with the people around us, right? So even if you feel like you're still building your skills and everyone around you is, you can still learn a lot from each other. And in fact, one of the most high value and low effort things that I do with my own group, and I recommend widely because anyone can do this, no matter where you're at, what resources you have, you can find a way to make this happen. That we have a monthly professional development lunch. And it doesn't even have to be lunch. In my lab, we all have to eat lunch at some point. So we bring our lunches or coffee or whatever, and we just gather together in a conference room. And sometimes we read through a book. But right now, we just choose some podcast or video that everyone can go and listen to for free. Everyone listens for, it's usually about a 20-minute video, either on their commute to work or while they're running experiments. Or for me, it's often on my morning jog. And then the person whose turn it is to lead the discussion just throws out there a few discussion questions that kind of like get us going. But we all just hang out for an hour and talk about that resource and learn from each other and from the speaker on that topic. And then it's a really simple, it costs nothing. It takes very little effort to organize, but we're able to grow together in that skill. Also, you can think about networking opportunities. It's not quite summer yet, but when you head out to those conferences this summer, when you're talking to other people during the social time, you can talk about science and you can also ask questions about leadership. Ask someone, how they learned how to be a good mentor to someone else or how they best, keep up on research for someone else that they're working with or how they set goals for themselves and others. We can learn a lot from each other in those conversations. And then finally, one that has become increasingly important to me the further I've gone in my career is to have what's called a phone a friend. So this is a reference to a game show from about 20 years ago, but it was a quiz show and people had the opportunity, like two lifelines, where if they didn't know the answer, they could literally call up a friend and ask them if they knew the answer. And so develop that phone a friend network. These are just all sorts of people who you know who might be in similar roles to yours. And where if you just need some advice, you can call them up and say, hey, I'm in this situation. I'm guessing you've been in a similar situation before. What would you do? And this could be anything from, a conflict with a coworker to making a decision about a career move to negotiating a job offer, all sorts of different things, right? We're surrounded by a whole bunch of people who all have wisdom that we can share with each other. All right. So you can definitely, take advantage of the resources that are out there, just as you wouldn't, walk into a lab and try and do a PCR without ever, reading up about how it works. But that alone is not sufficient. We need to actually practice these skills in order to effectively build them. But you also don't want to just dive in and do some, huge, dangerous experiment as your first time learning a new skill. So just like with our science skills, you want to start small and then build up. We want to do the same with these leadership skills. Some of them, like goal setting, you can just dive in and set some goals for yourself and see how that works. But when it's something where the stakes are higher, like a conflict resolution or leading a group of people through some initiative, you want to work on this in levels. So, a way to think about this is you can start kind of working alongside someone else so that you can talk about, what they're doing and what you're doing and learn from each other. And then next up, you can try it for yourself, but on kind of a smaller scale. And then finally, expand that scope, kind of go all in and lead something yourself. And so, a way to think about this for something like conflict resolution skills is that maybe, if you need to go in and help navigate a conflict, the first step might be to, take a trusted friend and say, hey, can we just sit down and kind of act this out and let me practice how I might approach this conversation? Or maybe, if appropriate, you can be present during a different conflict resolution and get to watch and participate alongside someone else. And then the next level is maybe you use those skills to address a minor situation of something that you're directly involved in. And then the bigger level would be now being prepared to, you know, go into a situation where multiple people might be in conflict with each other, the stakes might be high, but now you're equipped with those skills to serve as a mediator in that situation. All right. Next, of course, we never get these things right the first time. It is a lifelong learning process. And so it's really essential that we also get feedback so that we can figure out what's going well and what's not going well. This is something where leadership skills differ a little bit from research skills because in research, the feedback we get is usually quite direct and it is bad data, right? If we don't run an experiment correctly, it usually doesn't work. And then it's very, very apparent that we need to change something or we need to improve. When it comes to leadership skills, sometimes that happens, but more often than not, we actually need to go and work a little bit harder to get that feedback, right? But that's a really difficult thing. Receiving feedback can be extremely challenging, even though we know it's necessary. And just some of the reasons why it's challenging are that, that feedback might touch on something that's part of our self-identity, like we were talking about being a listener. Maybe you feel like you were a really good listener, and when someone tells you that you need to grow, that's a really painful thing to hear. And it can undermine our sense of self-efficacy, right? Because if you feel that that's an important skill to be a mentor or leader, then all of a sudden you're hearing that, oh, maybe I'm not as good as I thought in that role. Also, sometimes it comes from someone whose opinion we don't necessarily respect. Pulling on that one, you might be like, oh, well, you're a terrible listener, so how dare you tell me that? But it's not a reason to discount it, right? You don't necessarily, you have to, filter feedback, but often someone who you might not normally want to hear it from could have some really valuable insights that are worth listening to. And this is always the toughest one for me, is that often we know inherently deep down the places where we need to improve, but we also know that until someone tells us that, we can just kind of pretend like we don't need to work on it. But once someone, especially someone you mentor, has said, hey, you really need to be a better listener or better at goal setting or better at communicating. Once we've heard that, we kind of have to make that change, right? And that might take a lot of effort and a lot of time. And this all assumes that the feedback is delivered well. Actually, one of the books that's on my resource list that is one of my absolutely favorite books on this topic is the one I've shown here. It's called Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well by Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen. And some of Sheila Heen's podcasts are really spectacular as well. But the great part about this book, if you look close up at that little post-it, it says, even when it is off base, unfair, poorly delivered, and frankly, you're not in the mood. And so it shows that this is a really tough topic. But even when feedback is delivered poorly, there's still something that we can learn from it. So how do we go about getting feedback and who do we get feedback from? So the answer to this is really everybody. So in leadership literature, they often talk about a sort of 360, or I've heard scientists be like, yeah, it's really more of like a 180. But that's because we're kind of, particular about such things. But it's the idea that it's all of the people around you, right? That you need to get leadership from people who you're mentoring or feedback, sorry, from people you're mentoring, from people who are your peers, from people who might be your boss or your supervisor or the closest you have to that. And that's not all. I frequently get feedback from coaches, from friends, from informal mentors, all sorts of people who are seeing how I'm doing work and giving me feedback about how that can be better. So think really broadly across your network to think about the people who you can be going to for feedback. And then the key is that if you want good feedback that's helpful, you have to ask the right questions, right? If you just show up and are like, hey, so what do you think about my leadership? You may or may not get things that are actually helpful. But if you frame the questions to be really specific, then you're more likely to get something helpful. And so, some questions that we actually use in my own lab, we have an exercise where everyone in my lab gives each other feedback on our performance or anything that we ask about. And I can talk about that in the Q&A, but it's something that my own group members have driven themselves and want to do. And it's a really, really helpful exercise for us. But we use really specific questions so that we get high quality feedback. And so these are the three we use, or some variation on these. The first one is, my goal is to blank. My goal is to be, I always say, an outstanding leader and mentor to our lab. Someone else might say, my goal is to be a great safety officer for our lab. Or my goal is to prepare myself to apply for postdoc positions. And then you say, what do you see me doing well and where can I improve? Like, right? Not just like, what am I bad at? But rather, it's like, hey, tell me what I'm actually doing well and where can I get better and be specific. And then the second one is, hey, I've been working to develop for a long time. I said my listening skills. Where have you seen me improve? What's the positive, but also where do I still need to grow? And then finally, something like, what would you prioritize working on if you were in my situation? Realizing you don't have an infinite amount of time and emotional bandwidth, but that you need to think about what is most important to tackle first in service of that goal that you've mentioned at the start. All right. And then finally, the last thing we can do is to master something truly through teaching it to other people. And the education researchers tell us that this is the way that we achieve that highest level of mastery. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. It's kind of all of the different levels that we advance through as we learn something new, right? And you've probably seen this in classes you've taken, that you start out just kind of, memorizing things, I mean, hopefully no one had to memorize a periodic table and hopefully we've moved past that, but you might have, as a chemist, I had to memorize what some of the elements were, but then I started to understand, what that all meant and then apply that to problems, analyze, and then finally these highest levels of evaluating and creating, that's really what we tap into when we have to teach that skill to someone else. And so even if you feel like you were still very much so learning that skill, I feel that way for many skills, you also probably know much more than you think. And so you can think through what are the things that you sort of just automatically do, right? That maybe when an experiment hasn't worked, you just automatically dive into thinking about, okay, what could be all the reasons why, and how likely are these, and how would I figure out which one it is? That process that you've developed is something that could be really useful to someone who's just starting out in science, right? And so you can think about those different topics or ask the people around you what topics they're interested in. And then one of my friends, Rebecca Pope-O'Rourke, had said, you need to like excavate your knowledge. I love that term, to think about the things you do automatically, but then actually take a step back and say, well, when I just dive in and start doing that, what are the questions I'm actually asking? What is my process by which I'm doing this thing? How did I think of which controls I needed for this experiment? Or, how did I think about interpreting that data? So we can pull out, what are we actually doing when we exercise that skill? And then teach that to someone else. And that's really the key. That's the really, really fun thing, is that you know more than you think. But some of these things, the things you've mastered or have really developed, they become automatic. And by pulling out that actual process and the questions you're asking, that's where we really, really learn more ourselves. I think I almost learn more when I teach these things than the people who I'm teaching, right? Because you have to hit those highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy. All right. So your turn. I mentioned, the goal here is for everyone to walk away with one practical thing that you can do to build your leadership skills. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to just think about and again, write down. You don't have to get to all of these questions, but hit at least one or two of the first four. And then really important is to hit this last question. I'll give you a 1 minute warning, so you make sure you do this, is to have one action item, a book you're going to read, a podcast you're going to listen to, someone you're going to ask for advice or feedback, something you're going to teach to someone else. What's one practical thing that you're going to do? And if you're willing to, drop it in the chat. Okay, we'll give you 3 minutes. All right, this is that 1 minute warning. So if you haven't yet, get to that action item, write it down for yourself. Most importantly, put it on your calendar or to-do list. Actually, build it in as something that you're going to make time for. And then, if you're willing to, share it in the chat.
Hey, Jen, a couple of comments while the kids are thinking about stuff. So I think it's, I'm a retired and professor emeritus, but I still need to develop my leadership skills. So I think it's never too early to start and never too late to do that. I just put in the chat that our graduate students have started this lunchtime, book club, and it could be a book like,
Yeah.
yours or, others that are out there, getting to yes. There's all kinds of really popular books, but other ones are kind of about leadership, fictional books about leadership, and then somebody
Oh,
is,
that's fun.
leads the discussion, has read the book and leads the discussion, and there's a kind of a dialogue that occurs about that as well.
That's really, really fun. Yeah, my group has done, we've read quite a few books together and we try to hit the book over like 5 or 6 different lunches so we can really dive in on each topic. And then this semester we decided to do the webinar idea to just test it out. But I think one of my favorites is that we read Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, which is all about decision making. And we got to talk for like 6 lunches about why
Mm,
troubleshooting your experiments is a lot like playing poker. So that was actually the slide I had on the previous one is like and then I made a presentation about that for my class about, when you're trying to troubleshoot experiments, it's a betting game, it's a card game, but you want to be playing poker, not go fish. You want to be
yeah,
strategic, not just kind of random.
yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone who was willing to share. Hopefully, you've got something on your to-do list, again, as a really practical thing that you can do in the next week or two in order to keep building your leadership skills. Because Like we've talked about, these skills don't come intuitively to most of us, but neither did most of our technical skills. And just as we learned how to do science, we can learn how to lead ourselves and others well. And like we were just talking about, and Reinhardt was just saying, this is a continual process. Just like none of us will ever say, I have mastered my research field, right? There's always more to learn. We never hit that level of perfect mastery, but we can always keep improving through learning, trying, assessing, often failing, sharing, and growing together. And that this growth, it doesn't happen magically overnight, but rather it's just a series of these small intentional actions. It's learning something and then applying it, trying to make it better, teaching it to others. Though all of the small ways that we build this into our calendars, we build it into our practices, is what really makes a difference. And this is so incredibly important, right? That great leadership, it's not just for us, but it's for all of the people around us. That you are a leader right now, I would guess that everyone here is serving as a mentor, formally or informally, to someone else. And you're going to keep growing in your leadership throughout your career. And you're going to keep having the opportunity to serve as a mentor and leader to more and more people. And those people are counting on you to get it right. That the more you care about developing your skills, the more positive of a culture you're going to create for those people who you lead. And then guess what? They're going to learn their leadership skills from you and then carry those on to the people that they lead. And so this really has the power to create positive culture in science for generations of future scientists. And so it's so incredibly important, and also something that we can all do to make our field a better place to be. And with that, I have to finish by thanking all of the folks on this slide. This is my research group, kind of over the years and in different iterations of people. We actually are missing a few people. We need to get an updated photo. But I didn't talk about the research that they do. But them doing that research is the reason why I get to have this job and work with all of them as colleagues in the lab. They drive the ideas, they do the research in our lab, and they are all really phenomenal leaders who support each other and create an inclusive and fun environment in our research group. And it makes it just such a privilege to be colleagues with each of them. And so I have to thank them for that incredible opportunity. And thanks so much to ASBMB for hosting. Thanks to everyone for joining.
Great. So we still have a bit of time, so if you have some questions, please put them in the Q&A. Jane, we did have a couple of questions sent in earlier, and I think one of them is
Yeah.
kind of interesting one is what are, what is some of the leadership skills that people tend to overlook? I think we talked about communication,
Mm.
making sure that your communication skills are great, but there are other ones that maybe I had never thought of that. I guess I should put that into my portfolio.
Yeah, I will actually take a big picture approach to that. And I think
Sure.
one of the most important ones, especially for us in science, is that of not just how to be great leaders ourselves, but how to develop other leaders, right? That if we, and this is something where actually I was really excited. I got excited to write my book when I realized I could add in this section because most of what you read in the leadership literature is about how to lead and manage a team of people well. Say if you're working at Google and you have a team of engineers you're leading. But that's not our situation in science, right? That we are leading people who are also leaders now and who are going to keep going on to be leaders in more and more places. And so we need to not only be good at doing these things ourselves, like take conflict resolution. We need to not only be good at doing that, but we also need to be coaching the people we work with so that they can go on and do that for themselves. Or similarly, with communication, with listening, we need to be helping others develop those skills. And that itself is a leadership skill that takes, certain things like, going from a mindset of saying, oh, here's what you should do to a mindset that says, hey, what do you think that you should do? It takes that stepping back and asking rather than telling. And it takes things like vulnerability. It takes coaching skills. All of those things that, again, are so important, but we were never really trained how to do.
Yeah, so we have an interesting question in the Q&A, and it's
Oh,
about
yeah.
if you have these skills, and how do we leverage these skills that we have while applying for a job, say in a resume. I know one of my favorite questions I got when applying for a job, you might have got that too, is could you talk about a difficult situation that you had and how, the strategy you used to address it as a standard interview question, right? So,
Yeah, actually, that's one of my favorite interview questions I ask people. I
yeah,
actually ask people, tell me about a time that you, especially for leadership roles, I
yep.
ask, tell me about a time that you messed something up, you made a mistake and it impacted people, and how did you make it right? Because that, how someone answers that tells you a lot about them. But back to, just thinking about applying for a job, in a resume, I would say, look around at the norms because often you can put these skills, in your resume. Maybe you say, oh, I have expertise in, mass spec and, data analysis. And then right next to that might be science communication or leading a team or, communicating across disciplines. You can absolutely write those in there. For most jobs, you're going to get to write a cover letter. And I think that's where these sorts of skills really shine because anyone can write a skill in a resume or in a LinkedIn profile, but it's really how you tell the story about how you've done science where you can demonstrate that you've used these skills. So in your cover letter, you might talk about how you had to communicate and problem solve across, all of these different parts of your university or your company in order to get a new initiative going. When you tell the story of your science, you can not just, share all of the data, but you could actually talk about, like, oh, I ran into this issue and we realized we would need these experiments. And so here's how I went and found a collaborator and negotiated the collaboration and worked together. Or here's how we brought together a team and we really thought through the problem solving for this aspect of the project. And definitely on an interview, you can really, really bring out those stories as well. So I think, everywhere you can embed that is a great place to do it. But the more that you can back it up with specific examples, those are going to be the ones that really land powerfully for a hiring committee.
Yeah. Another question that came in earlier is about, how can I develop these leadership skills, like when I'm kind of stuck in the lab, working on my research. That's my top priority, a lot of pressure there to,
Yeah.
get the results, to publish the papers, to get the grants, to, write the thesis and all that. And, one thought I had was that leadership skills can be built everywhere. So you can volunteer, you can do in your own community. It doesn't have to be academic leadership. You could be, captain of the, women's field hockey team, and that's a leadership role. So again, maybe what advice would you have for people, to develop those leadership skills beyond maybe the day-to-day work that they're engaged in, in a lab or at a, in a department?
Yeah, I love that question. I actually just saw one come in the chat too that I might combine it with. And so the question in the chat is, do you think that building leadership skills should be a mandatory course in undergraduate, graduate class education? Would you pursue including in the curriculum in your school? The course can include, different situations. And I will say, I will answer by saying that's exactly what we've done here. And I'm really, really proud that we've done that because exactly as you were saying, Reinhardt, these skills are so important, that I tend to think of them as a multiplier. That, there's the effort that you put in that in science, has a loose relationship with the results that you get because a lot of it is unpredictable. But your leadership skills are this coefficient that is out in front of that effort and determines how effectively your effort will be translated into results. And that's, you can think about it in really obvious ways like, time management, how you organize your experiments so that, things that have a long wait time, you get done early so you can be doing other things, multitasking, again, how you troubleshoot, how you go and seek feedback from other people, things like project management, how you make a strategy for what you're going to do and when. All of those are such important skills that are not like a distraction from the research, but are actually really, really essential to the research. I mean, how well you can communicate will determine how well you can get your lab funded, right? Or get yourself funded for a fellowship. And so it's worth the time to do that. Thankfully, there are so many good podcasts and audiobooks, tons of free resources. So I'd say when you're, obviously when you're doing something you need to focus on what you're doing. But we all know, we all have times in our day that are just kind of routine, or you're, kind of spacing out while you're doing something that's really easy. And those are opportunities to just listen to a quick resource. I mean, I listen to a lot of these podcasts just on my drive to work, and it's 15 minutes, and I can think, okay, how am I going to apply this in my day to day? But then I will say to the course, yeah, so we started last year teaching a class called Thriving in Graduate School. And we offer this to our first year PhD students, and hopefully eventually to in an undergraduate research version as well. And we teach leadership skills like conflict resolution, negotiating, networking. This week, we're learning about how to deal with failure and all of the psychology of failure. We also learn time management, how to know if a research idea is a good idea, how to make it a better idea, how to communicate that to anyone from science experts in your field to the general public. And we cover all of those skills in 15 weeks. And I think that the positive reception for that from everyone in our department, more or less, has been because we all see how this can make us, it's not a distraction. Again, it's actually a part of making us good at the research that we're here to do, and also giving everyone skills for into the future.
Yeah. There was a question in the chat again about budget management,
Oh,
with
yeah.
that. Again, that's at the personal level all the way up to university levels. There's all kinds of budget things. Again, my advice there would be
Yeah.
is, surprising to me, like how many students don't ask their supervisor to share their last successful, like NIH grant, right? Let's go. Could you mind sharing that with me because it was successful, just to see where
Yeah.
I fit into the big picture? And then there's a budget page there that goes through the minutia. Because when your supervisor comes to you and says, "Sorry, we haven't any money to buy those antibodies because what whatever," that does happen, right? And that can cause frustration. But again, it's just communication about stuff. So again, I think there's ways you can, and if you we had one student who loved, martial arts when they were in undergrad. They got, I'm too busy as a grad student. I don't have time. And they realized that was a stress buster. They were less
Yes.
productive actually. So they joined up and then they were looking for like a finance, a treasurer for the organization, took a couple of online courses, about, bookkeeping basically and compliance and that. And then ended up getting a job working for one of our health charities, being their budget manager, like
Cool.
so again, there's ways. So what are your thoughts about, these other skills like budget management is not one that
Yeah.
most people think about as a essential life skill for sure these days, for sure. But how do you, get that, develop that skill, for example?
Yeah. Oh, that's such an important one. And I think that it's something where no matter where you are a leader and what you're doing, sharing about whatever you know about the budget with who you're working with. If you're a graduate student, even just telling the undergraduate who you're mentoring, here's what we're buying, here's how much it costs, here are
Mm,
the things that are really cheap, and if you waste it, it's fine. Well, it's not okay. It's less bad. Here are the things like that antibody that is so, every time you pipette 20 microliters of this, that's like $100, right? Making sure that you're mentoring someone on a sense of how much do things cost and where does this come from. I will say that as a PI, we had a conversation about budgets a while back as part of a professional development series on grants. And I talked about, was like, okay, here's a bunch of boring details, but it's so important to know of like when you apply for a grant, there's a budget and there's salary and then there's fringe on the salary. But then also with the budget, there's facilities and administration. And how does all that work and what does it pay for? Because, I mean, we talked about this a few years ago, but especially in the US, in the last year, this has been such an important topic to understand, like these facilities and administration costs. We divided up and said, okay, you're all new faculty, you're applying for this type of grant and you're applying for this type of grant. Here's what things cost. How would you spend your money? What kinds of people would you hire? How much would you pay yourself? How much would you leave to buy these materials and supplies? I think those are all super important. I will say that at higher leadership positions, actually, one of the really amazing things that doesn't get talked about often enough is that as you advance in your career, the more you're able to like specialize and use skills that are naturally your strengths. When you're a graduate student, you kind of, or an undergrad, you have to do it all. You have to be, you have to communicate, you have to run experiments, you have to manage a budget probably, or some sort of a budget. You kind of have to learn to do everything. But then as you rise to higher and higher leadership roles, often you have someone who you work with who is actually an accountant. So I will say, being a department chair, I am good at broad brushstrokes of budgets of like, hey, kind of, what are our priorities? I am really not good at digging into a spreadsheet and managing every line item. But the amazing thing is I have someone sitting in an office, actually 3 feet from my office, who is brilliant at that. And so it's learning how to see yourself as part of a team. And one of the really fun things is realizing that you're surrounded by people who have better skill, who are better than you at a lot of the things that are going to get done, and that you get to work with this really talented group of people and let everyone use their skills to collectively achieve your goal.
Yeah. There's a couple of comments about books. Now you have your list of
Yeah.
books that you're still curating away there, adding to. And maybe you can, I have one book that we've discussed quite recently. It's actually not a guidebook, but it's a biography of Rosalind Franklin.
Oh,
And
cool.
how her experience with the Watson and Crick empire, where she had actually the critical data to solve the structure of the double helix. It's a very good read for women in science for sure, and others, maybe how you feel about your place in the whole mix of science. So, and there's a few books out about her, and there's maybe others.
Yeah.
Is there a book maybe that a fictional a book or a biographical book that maybe, you've
Oh.
thought about, or sorry to put you on the spot.
That's a tough one. I would say mostly what we read is leadership literature. But if you want some fun ones to navigate into first, I mean, Thinking in Bets is really fun because it's just all about poker and playing poker and decision making. So it's kind of and it has
Yeah.
a lot of entertaining vignettes. One of my favorites too, one of the very first kind of quote unquote leadership books I read is called Creativity Inc. It's by Ed Catmull, and it's the story of Pixar, who makes
Yeah.
all of these animated movies. But it's really a story about how you create a culture of candor, how you deal with failure, how you work together as a team. And there's this phenomenal parallel in there of the ways that they make movies, the way they go from a nascent idea
Yeah.
through all of the ups and downs and twists and turns and failures of developing that into a final product is actually really, really similar to how we develop research projects and how you get from that initial idea kind of through all the failure and struggle and doubt into a paper or a grant or a final product. And so I really enjoyed reading that with that lens, and it taught me a lot. But it's mostly a story about how a company works and how they founded Pixar and all of that. So it's a great read.
Yeah, one along those lines I read a few years ago, actually, when I became chair, is called Good to Great. I forgot who the authors were,
Oh
but
yeah,
it
John
also is about
Maxwell, right?
it's about companies,
Yeah,
right? Some who have transitioned and moved and become very successful, others that didn't adapt to the times and became, extinct basically, right? And
yeah,
it's a very interesting book because it's kind of about how, transitional leadership, right? Where there's big changes coming, there's forces from the outside, you stick to your knitting, and what do you do? Do you change? How do you change? So that's a very good one. So good to great. So we're up to
yeah.
the last minute. So you have a final word, Jen, before I thank you for all those insights that you provided to everyone on the
I'll
Zoom
just
today.
say, thanks to everyone for being here and thanks for caring about this topic because it's not something that is necessarily obvious in our scientific training. It may not be something where the reward structure for building your leadership skills, it's definitely not as obvious as, say, getting the next paper or getting some key experiments done, but it is so incredibly important, not only for yourself, but especially for the people around you. And so this is how we make science the place that we want it to be. And so I just want to say, give yourself a pat on the back or a round of applause. Give yourself some credit for all of the work you have done and all of the work that you're going to do in this area because it makes a real impact.
Yep. So thanks a lot again, Jen. And also like to thank the people who took time out of their busy lives where they maybe should have been, in the lab doing experiments for the last hour, but took out time. I think it was a valuable experience. Again, thank you to all. And there are other ASBMB professional development webinars that come up. Just go to the site. And I did put on in the chat, that annual meeting that's coming up in Washington area this year is a great opportunity, to show your science and meet colleagues, develop your professional skills, and build your professional networks. I hope to see a lot of you at the annual meeting as well. Thanks a lot, Jen. We'll sign off.